Hello viewers and learners of the module MEVE 001 Environmental Impact Assessment for Environmental Health. I introduce myself as Dr. Sushmita Bhaskar, working in the discipline of Environmental Studies at the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. In this module, we will discuss on vegetation and wildlife impact assessment. After reading this module, you will be able to describe the vegetation and wildlife impact analysis and certain processes as to how we can analyze the same. Now, the human population is growing at an unprecedented rate, and this is giving a lot of stress. It is exerting stress and causing change in the environment as well as its resources for both the plants, animals and the human beings. So, due to human interplay and anthropogenic activities, the vegetation and wildlife resources are being threatened. The anthropogenic activities such as fishing, hunting, ecosystem fragmentation, deforestation like the fuel wood gathering, fire and overgrazing, human settlement, etc. have caused tremendous ecological effects on the vegetation as well as the wildlife. Human beings, in order to fulfill their material ambitions, they have depleted the natural renewable and non-renewable resources, and these are assets that are necessary for our survival. Globally, if you see now, the human population are increasing continuously, and it is expected that by 2150 the population will even reach up to 10 billion, which is really an alarming level. Due to overpopulation and increasing demand of urbanization, each year 20 to 30 million people migrate from the rural area to the urban areas. So, overpopulation and poverty that will lead to urbanization, industrial revolution, and they have major impact on the global health, global warming, food scarcity and environmental health. All these factors, they have negative impacts on the vegetation and the wildlife. Now, in general, vegetation is a plant life of any region, and it is a most copious biotic element of the biosphere. So, without vegetation we cannot survive. This regulates the flow of the biogeochemical cycles, and most critically for the water cycle, the hydrological cycle, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, the water cycle, then you have the phosphorus, the sulfur cycle, and it is very important in the global energy balances. So, global vegetation is a primary source of oxygen. It plays a critical role in the biosphere at all possible spatial scales, and disruption in these biogeochemical cycle that will lead to elevation in the ozone concentration and also to the ecosystem acidification. Vegetation, this serves as a wildlife habitat and energy source. The impact of environment on vegetation that can lead to a decline, for example, in the amphibian population, in the death of the coral reef, global warming and so on, which ultimately decrease the biodiversity. Environmental degradation. This is a serious threat, and that is leading to the wildlife extinction, which has a fatal impact on the human race. Environmental pollutants can alter the wildlife viability. It is estimated that in the past 40 years, 50% of the total wildlife has been lost, and by the year right now, it is 2020, they are saying that 68% of the world wildlife will be either extinct or we will lose the same. So, that means we need to conserve our resources more properly, and we need to manage them well. In 2018, a report and a research report that was published in PNAS journal showed that till date 83% of wild animals, 80% of the marine animals and 50% of the plants and fishes have been lost due to human civilization from the beginning, like the amount of species diversity that existed, but now that has been reduced. Let us now see some biological concepts and terms which are useful for the study. The analysis of environmental and occupational impact on vegetation and wildlife. This will be done with the help of systems like environmental laws, mathematical matrix models, measurement tools, risk assessment, analytical techniques and so on. Some of the important biological concepts and terms. The biological assessment. So, it is an assessment of the condition of any water body by sampling the species that spend all or part of their lives in that water body. Biological survey, a systematic method for collecting a consistent, reproducible and reliable sample of the aquatic biological community in a water body. Then there are biological indicators. They are group of organisms that can be employed to assess the condition of an ecosystem or environment. And depending on the type of the water body being sampled, the biological indicators used in the surveys can include the following. The reference sites. They are data collected at reference sites and they provide a benchmark for assessing the biological condition of the surveyed sites. And the reference sites are those sites which have not been disturbed by the anthropogenic activities or human stress, and they have been influenced to some extent by human activities, and they represent our best approximation of the natural conditions. Now, data from the reference site that can be used to develop the management target for protection and restoration of the aquatic resource, for example fish. It can be trouts, the sunfish, the perch, the salmons, benthic macroinvertebrates like insects, snails, crayfish, worms and so on, periphytons like algae, amphibians like frogs and salamanders, macrophytes like aquatic plants, birds like residential or migratory. Species. It is a basic unit of classification and a taxonomic rank as well as a unit of biodiversity. Community. It is also called biological community in a biology and an interacting group of various species in a common location. For example, a forest of trees and undergrowth plants that are inhabited by animals and rooted in soil containing bacteria and fungi, that constitutes a biological community. Habitat. It is a type of natural environment in which a particular species of organism is living. It is characterized by both physical and biological features, and a species habitat is those places where it can find food, shelter and protection and mates for the reproduction. Then there are endangered species. It is a species of animal or plants that is seriously at the risk of extinction. So, impact assessment is a process that can help in decision making and to ensure that the project and the program options under consideration are environmentally and socially sound and sustainable. It is concerned with identifying, predicting and evaluating the foreseeable impacts, both beneficial and adverse, of the public and private activities, developmental activities, alternatives and mitigating measures, and aims to eliminate or minimize the negative impacts and optimize positive impacts. Through EIA techniques that vary from country to country and organization to organization, there are stages that are common to most of the EIA processes. The role of the flora and the fauna investigation in EIA is to provide sufficient data to allow a complete identification, prediction and evaluation of potential impacts of the proposed developments upon that flora and the fauna. Mitigation measures and procedures. That is a development of the mitigation plan for the prevention of the loss of flora as well as fauna at that construction site. And the appropriate measures for the mitigation of habitat loss or degradation, all this depend upon the habitat type, the specific degrading activities, stress processes and habitat impacts. For a mitigation to be successful, the ecological integrity of that habitat also should be maintained. This can be accomplished directly by preservation measures that avoids impacts. In other cases, careful mitigation plans can reduce or eliminate impacts on the integrity of the habitat. Mitigations will also involve the guidance to address the habitat impacts of destruction, fragmentation, simplification and degradation that can include the following, like for example preservation, the outright purchase or the set aside of the land, partial purchase through conservation easements, long-term leases or the management agreements. The management practices can also involve the rotation and method of the timber harvesting, timing and extent of grazing, control of pollution and elimination of the structures. Restoration. There can be direct manipulation through seedings, plantings, physical or chemical treatment, creation of wetland, control of pollution, removal of barriers to fish migration, control of livestock access to riparian areas. Compensation. Purchase of lands of comparable habitat size and quality, provision of financial restitution. Then the mitigation principles, the development of this should be based on a thorough understanding of the site condition and the activities that are impacting habitats. But certain principles of ecological management should be followed when specific mitigation measures are to be developed. Now, these are the following mitigation principles that will apply to all the habitat conservation efforts. Baseline or the base mitigation goals and objectives on a landscape analysis that will consider the needs of that region, mimic the natural processes and promote native species, protect the rare and ecologically important species and communities, because certain species would be growing only in certain regions and they may be rare and they may be ecologically important. So, we need to protect those species. Then minimize the fragmentation of the habitat and promote connectivity of the natural areas. Maintain structural diversity of the habitats and promote natural diversity in that area. for the management of site-specific environmental conditions and impacts of the specific activity causing degradation, monitoring the habitat impacts from activities and thereby plan the mitigation processes. There are also alternate means of addressing the impacts. Like knowing the impact, the next step is to determine what can be done about it. So, the proponent identifies several means of addressing this impact, and one thing is doing nothing about it, that can be an alternate. You can have brainstorming sessions, open dialogues with the stakeholders, there can be surveys of similar impacts and some responses can also help. Innovative solutions can be there and that should be encouraged and considered at this stage. Let us take now an example. If we take the wood duck as an example, the person or the executive in charge, he notes down the response of the individuals to create habitats by building the wooden nesting boxes and placing them near the water bodies. One option for the executive is to produce a wooden box that is ready for the assembly. Another is he will give funds to an NGO that is going to conduct certain detailed studies regarding the wood duck's nesting habit, and it will determine the optimal location for the woodland along the river, and then reforestation is done. One more option is to produce a paper nesting box. So, with more open discussions, the list of options can go on, and finally they can come up with some innovative alternative. Thereby, some numerous options will be available to the policy proponent, and then he can institute a policy which can ban or limit the wood duck hunting. He can introduce new subsidy for the reintroduction of wetlands, which can create incentives for the conservation. Then we need to assess the cost and benefits of each alternative. So, everything has in socio-economics and in economics, the cost and benefit analysis is very important, and that will determine which alternative is the best response. That should use the monetary valuations where possible. It can also give the qualitative information. Through quantitative data that relies on economic and ecological expertise, the qualitative data most often comes from community sources. Including the equally considering qualitative data, public participation is also taken seriously, that can also be carried out effectively. Selective and alternative. By selecting alternatives, we should recognize the constraints, the country and the region's social, cultural and political values. The selection should reflect an equitable sharing of the distribution of benefits that are derived from the use of biological resources. Making the selection and supporting reasons explicitly to the public help to ensure the equitable distribution. Methodology for the assessment of terrestrial flora and the fauna assessment. We can have the desk based evaluation for all the relevant information. This is done by doing some existing review of literature, database, site specific information for the study area that is proposed. A list of potentially threatened flora and the fauna species that should be listed out. Then a land cover and a vegetation map should be made. The area of the development project is overlaid so that to determine the direct impact for that flora and the fauna in that area. That will be used to delineate and stratify the sampling sites for the flora and the fauna assessment. Baseline studies. This is an important and first stage study. It is important in gaining an understanding of how the system might be changed by the proposed project, and it can take a snapshot of the existing conditions, that is the baseline environment. The baseline survey provides the necessary information on the site specific environmental setting of the project, and that should include information about the components of the biodiversity, for example the ecosystem and the species in particular that may be affected. Baseline studies establish a foundation for impact prediction, for monitoring the predicted impacts and for evaluating the success of the mitigation measures. What are the things to be considered in the baseline survey? Site characterization and survey methods. A combination of different methods is also being used. For example, transects. They are used to survey changes in the vegetation along an environmental gradient from a source of impact or through different habitats. The line transect method, that is used to count the plant species and their abundance that touch the transect line. Then we have the belt transect, that is done by laying a transect line with 50-meter length and 10-meter width on sides of the transect line. All the trees within the belt transect with diameters greater than 5 cm at breast height will be identified, and they will be measured for the diameter at the breast height and then counted. Then quadrats. These are used to define the sample area within the study site. The locations of the quadrat chosen should be representative to the various vegetation types present within the study area, and usually several quadrats are sampled to obtain more representative results. The plant species inside the quadrats are identified, the density, the frequency and the relative cover also will be estimated. This allows for the computation of the importance value index of the species that are present in that particular area. Transect count. This is used to survey the birds in large open areas of relatively uniform habitat. So, all the birds that are seen on both sides of the transects are identified. They are counted to a distance where the birds are still detectable or within a fixed distance from the observer. Then you have the mist nets. This is used to capture birds and bats and the birds. The nets are placed at travel lanes of the lanes of the bats at dusk, and they are tended constantly. Any captured bat that must be removed individually upon entanglement may be in some temporary devices like the cloth bag. The same is done with birds, but with the birds we do it at dawn. Bats it is done generally at dusk or in the evening time. Trapping. Box traps with appropriate bait is an effective means for trapping the small terrestrial mammals which are unharmed so that they are unharmed. Pitfall traps, they can also be used to trap the small mammals such as shrews when the animals falls through the opening into the container. Active searching. This is an effective way to survey the amphibians and reptiles by active searching, particularly during the daytime. And this is applicable also during the nocturnal and the diurnal species. You can do the active searching process. Sampling effort. So, the baseline survey will collect the ecological data through sampling. The actual sampling would depend on the physical size of the site, the diversity of the habitats, flora and fauna, and availability of the existing ecological baseline information. So, the environmental consultants will determine the appropriate amount of sampling based on their professional judgment and actual site situations. In all the cases, they have to ensure that there are adequate samples to be able to gather the data representative of the population of that area. Duration of the survey is also important. So, this should be long enough for gathering the necessary baseline data. Generally, the duration of the ecological survey should be commensurate with the scale of the proposed development, the diversity of the habitats within the study area, and the diversity of the flora and the fauna within the study area. Then identification of important species, endemicity and its conservation status. So, there should be a priority list for these species, and it should be maintained so that rehabilitation of the area also can be done to increase their populations. Biodiversity index. This is a quantitative measure that reflects how many types, like how many species are there in a data set, and simultaneously it can take into account how evenly the basic entities like the individuals are distributed among those types. Then evaluation, that is impact analysis. After establishing the baseline, then we have to work systematically through the various activities and aspects of development to determine the likely effects of those activities on the baseline, and the nature of the impact, direct or indirect, long term or short term, and effects from the cumulative impacts. All these need to be noted down. The type of impact: positive, which is enhancing biodiversity; negative, that is causing biodiversity loss; or neutral, that is causing no net change. The likely magnitude of the residual impact, then the level of the impact, the species or ecosystem level, that is the species richness, the diversity, endemicity, vulnerability, all this has to be observed. Finally, the biotic factors are also used for the analysis of environmental impact on vegetation and wildlife. They can be categorized as biotic assessment. This uses the presence and condition and abundance of species of fish, of mammals, of birds, insects, algae, plants and other organisms to determine the health of an ecosystem, and it provides information on the physical and chemical characteristics that are present. Example, nutrient enrichment, pollutant flow rate and also the sediment levels. These are important tools to assess the environmental impact, and bioindicators, they help us to predict the natural state of any region or the degree of contamination present at that area. An example of biological assessment in the field. So, a biological survey is conducted on different stream, for example, to determine the stream's structure. The benthic macroinvertebrate assemblage is a biological indicator. Then the matrices such as the relative richness, these can be selected. The condition represented by the undisturbed or minimally disturbed stream or reference sites is used to assess the changes in the different values from other communities with increasing stress. As the level of stress increases in these streams, the aquatic communities and compositions were measurably changed. The species that are sensitive to stress disappear and more pollution tolerant species are found. So, those species were identified in order to indicate their general level of sensitivity and ability to tolerate pollution. For example, intermediate species, we can denote them as S, moderately tolerant species are denoted by M, and the tolerant species can be denoted by T. So, that is the biotic assessment. Dear learners and the viewers of this course and module, so here we have understood some basic concepts in the wildlife and the vegetation impact analysis, and what are the techniques and the processes that are employed for the same. We also got to know about the biological indicators and also the stress responses in the biotic assessment, like how the species can be identified and how we can indicate their general sensitivity to stress and how they can tolerate the pollution. So, these are some ways how we can analyze the impact assessment in various habitats, and also analyze the importance of certain habitats also where there is species richness, where there is species diversity, and all these needs to be taken into account before giving any approval for any environmental project and proposal that comes in the way. Thank you for your patient listening.